Hey everybody, today I'll be starting a new series discussing the soundtrack of Demon's Souls. There's a ton of stuff to talk about. This series will be split into 2 or 3 videos. Anything not covered here will be covered in subsequent entries. I'll be showing each boss fight and portions of the surrounding levels, so there will be spoilers for the whole game. If you haven't played Demon's Souls, I recommend that you do before watching this video. One thing I'll suggest is to try putting yourself in the shoes of someone playing through Demon's Souls for the very first time. I think this will help you better appreciate the sound. Let's start with Phalanx, the first boss fight in Boletaria. One of the themes of the boss tracks in Demon's Souls is that they align well with the setting and pacing of the fight. As you enter the fight, you hear the sound of war drums, as though you're entering an epic clash between 2 armies. As you start the fight, the clash of your sword against enemy shields and the sound of projectiles striking across the room mesh perfectly with the sense of a large-scale battle. As you take damage and fall back to heal, the strings slow down and the drum beats are emphasized, pulling the player's mental state back a little bit and giving the fight a much needed feeling of gravity. The track swaps back and forth between these 2 patterns, matching the ebb and flow of the battle. As the fight nears its conclusion, the drum beats fade, and the backing strings and brass give the impression of overcoming the tide, aligning with the feeling the player is getting as they wear down Phalanx's defenses and begin attacking her weak spot. This track does an excellent job conveying a sense of gravity purely through sound. Phalanx's guards are slow, and Phalanx herself is defenseless without them. Nothing about this fight is particularly challenging, yet, thanks to the soundtrack, the fight feels intense and epic. The player walks away from the fight feeling like they overcame a really tough enemy. This is a great capstone to a long and relatively difficult first level. This track is particularly powerful when you listen to it after painstakingly clearing the rest of the stage. It's a crescendo after a long and patient build-up. Demon's Souls' soundtrack does an excellent job conveying exactly the experience the designers intend the player to feel as they progress through the game.
You have a heart of gold. Don't let them take it from you.
Next up is the fight with the Tower Knight in the second stage of Boletaria. The first sound the player hears is the laughter of the Fat Minister as he commands the crossbowmen to rise and shoot. This, combined with the image of the Tower Knight, is intimidating and imposing. In contrast with the Phalanx, the soundtrack doesn't convey the feeling of a battle. Instead, the booming sounds of Tower Knight's attacks play off the short, blunt singing in the background. This gives the player a sense of individually overcoming extremely difficult odds. Phalanx felt like a battle. This feels like a one-on-many struggle, which meshes well with the design of Tower Knight. As the player makes their way around the arena, the singer's notes lengthen and create a lull in the music. This lull is important because it plays into the player's mental state. They're mentally preparing themselves for a heavily armored enemy that feels impossible to imagine defeating. These lulls are almost philosophical, prompting the player to think about the absurdity of this engagement. There's a reflective, almost religious element to this track. Again, it conveys a strong sense of gravity. Here again, we see close alignment between the setting and theme of the fight and the backing track. The sound genuinely complements and aligns with the fight. The feeling of intimidation and struggling against enormous odds are clearly conveyed to the player. I think this is part of the reason Demon's Souls is so immersive. Each element in the game complements every other element, creating a unified atmosphere. A player can describe the sense they get fighting the Tower Knight for the first time just by listening to the soundtrack. In comparison, let's take a look at the last giant fight in Dark Souls 2, which has a similar setup. Another intimidating, very imposing enemy. The fight lacks any initial sound, instead jumping straight into fairly fast-paced battle music, which juxtaposes poorly with the sadness the player feels seeing the trapped giant. In addition, there's no ebb and flow, there's no reflective aspect, nor is there an alignment with the struggle against a huge, imposing enemy. Similarly, contrast the sound effects of hitting each boss. With the Tower Knight, there's a sense of incremental progress as your sword clashes with the metal and air rushes out. The last giant simply sounds like you're beating up a piece of meat. Let's take a look at the fight with the Penetrator in the third area of Boletaria. Similarly to the Tower Knight, this fight has an excellent opening. The long and continuous gushing of blood, juxtaposed with the groans of the dying fat minister, instantly convey a sense of an efficient, terrifying executioner. This feeling is reinforced by the clean and sharp swipes of the Penetrator's sword through the air. Unfortunately, the sound of the fight itself is fairly weak. In the footage here, the Tower Knight soundtrack is reused. I don't know how to get Demon's Souls to play the Penetrator specific track, which is slightly better. It has a Jaws-like feel to it. There's no sense of struggle against the Penetrator. While initially intimidating, you quickly realize he's just another knight. Most players will end up tanking his hits and spamming grass. The struggle and reflective aspects of the Tower Knight soundtrack simply don't work here. The Penetrator specific track works slightly better because it conveys a sense of being hunted. Still, the player never really gets that sense as they progress through this fight, nor from the preceding level. Players work through a gauntlet to reach this boss. Each retry requires fighting waves of fairly difficult enemies. After all this, the player just wants to move on. The sense of being hunted isn't properly conveyed in the third area of Boletaria, making it feel even more out of place in this fight. Finally, let's talk about Old King Allant. As the player enters the fight, the shrill, sharp sounds of an organ set the stage. Both the music and the layout of the battle give the sense of fighting in a cathedral. King Allant's white aesthetic and glowing sword give the impression that he is more the high priest of Boletaria than its king. The groan of King Allant as he prepares his attacks punctuates the track with the sense of an angry god lashing out at the denizens of the world. Once again, we see a close alignment of gameplay elements in the fight with Allant. Everything comes together to create an epic last battle infused with the sense of overcoming a god. The visuals, stage layout, and sound work together to create this effect. Thematically, this fits in nicely with the plot device that worshippers of God in Demon Souls are, in fact, worshipping the Old One. The fight with Allant caps off the theme of verticality in Boletaria. Let's take another quick look at the introductory sequence. Pay close attention to the sound of wind in the background. As the player moves through Boletaria, there is a consistent theme of moving upward. Each stage has the player travel closer to the pinnacle of the castle. The sound reflects this, growing more intense with each track. This is tied together by the sound of strong winds beating against the castle as the player is introduced to Allant, giving the impression of fighting on the very top of the world. The sound and level design play off each other to provide the player a feeling of ascension, of reaching the summit, not just physically in the sense of the physical level layout, but metaphorically in the sense of having conquered the game, and all of its intense challenges as well. Before we move on to Fang, let's touch on a minor but powerful detail of the sound. When players are in human form, they can hear their own footsteps and rolls. Take a listen. Contrast this with soul form, where footsteps and rolls are silent. The difference is subtle but important. There's a weight to being human that's communicated purely through sound. Compare the sound of dying as well. Players that die in human form hear the audible sound of death, adding a real sense of loss. Players in soul form don't hear anything. This is another way Demon Souls, quietly but very intentionally, reinforces its underlying game mechanics and builds a cohesive, immersive world. Human form is valuable and worth holding onto. Soul form is lesser, not ideal, practically transient. Players can understand this message without even looking at the screen. Alright, it's time for Fang. Like Boletaria, Fang effectively uses verticality. Here, players descend deep into the mine. We see a similar theme in the music. Let's first take a look at the armored spider fight. Here, we see fast-paced music that transitions in and out with emphasis on strings and brass. There's an industrial regularity to this music that aligns well with the mine's environment. The boss's moveset is similarly timed, containing regular, even blasts of fireballs, spider silk, and melee attacks. One can almost imagine the miners of Fang rolling out the armored spider on an assembly line. Not very much stood out to me about this track. It works well and does its job, but it lacks the emotional punch of the tracks in Volataria. I wonder if this is partly intentional to reinforce the environment's sturdy, industrial nature. As the player descends further into the mine, they encounter Flame Lurker. This fight and its music are so good that they were actually what convinced me to make this video. Let's start with the introductory cinematic. Pay close attention to the emphasis on Flame Lurker and the lack of a backing track. As the player watches this scene, what stands out most is the sharp clash of Flame Lurker's claws on the bars of the shrine, almost metal on metal. There's a sense that this is more than just a beast as he groans and blasts his way into the room. As the fight unfolds, the deep, slow sounds of the organ are punctuated by Flame Lurker's powerful explosions. The track regularly eases into long, slow strings that invoke a feeling of resigned sorrow. Miyazaki often talked about trying to communicate beauty when asked about Dark Souls' aesthetic, and I think a similar theme shows in Demon's Souls. As foreboding as Flame Lurker is, there's a certain beauty to the sound that makes one reluctant to describe him as evil. There's a tension in this fight as you dodge his slow but powerful attacks that's heightened by the slow, deep notes of the track. FromSoft could have easily used an industrial, fast-paced theme for this incredibly difficult fight, but that wouldn't have properly set the tone or atmosphere as well as what's in the game today. What really stands out to me is how different the fight feels playing it with and without the backing soundtrack. Take a look. The track adds a sense of dread and intensity to the fight that simply isn't captured by what's happening on screen alone. Players finally descend to the bottom of Fang as they fight the Dragon God. One thing worth mentioning. It was pointed out in Dark Souls 2 that the Majula theme is set to exactly 60 beats per minute. It was hypothesized that this is intentional to induce a relaxed, slow heartbeat in the player. Dragon God's track is quiet but fast, invoking a sense of tension. It matches the fight well. The player is slowly inching their way around the arena. You can practically hear your heartbeat as you progress through the fight. The Dragon God, unfortunately, is a gimmicky and poorly thought out fight. We've discussed how the soundtrack works best when it aligns with the other elements of the game, from the enemy design to the stage layout. There's not much to work with here. Nevertheless, I think the composer did quite well considering what he was working with. Tying all this together, the tracks of Stonefang grow deeper and slower, matching the player's descent into the mine. While I identified a spiritual element in Balataria's tracks, I see an industrial theme spanning the sound of Stonefang. Okay, that's everything for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time.